She was 22 years old, had exactly $3 to her name, and was standing at the edge of a crowd of men who were laughing at her before she had even raised her hand to bid. The shed they were laughing about sat at the far end of Gallant Wharf, listing slightly to the east, like a drunk leaning on a fence post. Its boards had gone gray with salt and time. Half the shingles were missing. A rope of old kelp had blown up against the door and dried there, stiff as wire. The men in the crowd had already decided that whoever ended up with Lot 9 was getting taken. And when the auctioneer called it out, one fish shed and its contents, situated at the terminus of the Gallant Wharf, to be removed at buyer's expense, a merchant near the front said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that it wasn't worth the nails it was built with. But Nola Birch was not looking at the rot. She was looking at the bones. We are glad you found us tonight. Settle in close, because this is the kind of story that asks something of you, not your pity, and not your patience, but your attention, the sort of attention you give to something that others have passed right by. Pull up a chair. We'll begin at the beginning, which is to say, we'll begin with the end of everything else. Nola had not always been alone. She had come to the harbour town of Port Gallant, Nova Scotia, 4 years earlier, with her great-aunt, Margot Finnie, a woman of few words and extraordinary hands. Margot had raised Nola from the age of 7, after Nola's parents were taken by a fever that swept through their village in a single bitter winter. Margot was her mother's father's sister, old and solitary and not particularly warm, but she was there, and she was steady, and in the life of a 7-year-old girl with nowhere else to go, that had counted for everything. Margot Finnie had spent 40 years mending nets for the fishing families of the Northumberland shore. It was work that most people found tedious and invisible, the long, careful threading of twine through damaged mesh, the quiet logic of knots that held or failed in cold water miles from shore. But Margot understood nets the way some people understand music, as systems with their own grammar, their own tensions, their own way of failing and of holding. She had taught Nola everything she knew. She started when Nola was 9, with a small practice net hung between 2 chairs in the kitchen. She put a bone needle into the girl's hand, a flat, smooth tool she had carved herself from a piece of ox leg bone polished to a soft sheen over years of use. And she said, "Look at where it broke. The break tells you everything about the stress. Learn to read the break before you reach for the needle." By the time Nola was 14, she could mend a 60-fathom herring seine in a day. By 16, the fishing captains were asking for her by name. Margot would sit nearby and drink her tea, and she would not say she was proud, but sometimes her hands would still in her lap, and she would watch Nola work with an expression that was as close to pride as she ever got. But the Northumberland shore, like all beautiful places, was unforgiving. Margot's heart gave out on a February morning when Nola was 21, on a day so cold the harbour ice made sounds like distant cannon fire. She passed quietly in her chair by the window, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She had rented the cottage from the parish. She had no property to leave and no savings to speak of. The parish gave Nola 30 days. She did not beg. Margot had not raised her to beg. She packed her trunk, settled her account at the general store with the last of what she had earned that season, and pressed the bone needle into her coat pocket where she could feel it with her thumb. She arrived in Port Gallant with her trunk, the needle, and less than $4 to her name. She took a room above the chandlery, the cheapest in town, and looked for work. Net mending was seasonal, and this was early spring. She took in laundry, mended clothes, helped the baker's wife on market days. Each week the coins in her purse grew fewer. When she counted what remained one gray Sunday morning, there were $3.37, and she understood that she was nearly at the bottom of the well. It was then that she saw the notice tacked to the post office wall. Sheriff's auction, delinquent properties and unclaimed assets. Monday morning, Harbour front. She went not because she had a plan. She went because she needed to do something. Because standing still in the face of the quiet, creeping nothing, was a kind of defeat she refused to accept. The auction was held on a gray Monday. The sky the color of old pewter, the wind off the strait, cold enough to make your eyes water. The crowd was made up of merchantmen, boat owners, and dock workers, broad-shouldered, weathered, deeply certain that a woman standing alone at the edge of the lot was either lost or foolish. The auctioneer moved briskly through the early lots. A coil of anchor chain, 3 broken lobster boats in need of complete rebuilding, an unclaimed cargo of salt that had partially dissolved in a leaking warehouse. Then he reached Lot 9. One fish shed, he called out, situated at the terminus of the Gallant Wharf, contents included, sold as is, where is, removal at buyer's expense. A low ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Someone said the shed had been half-eaten by seaworms. Someone else said it wasn't worth the lumber you'd get from tearing it down, and lumber wasn't worth much this season anyhow. The auctioneer himself was smiling slightly, the way a man smiles when he knows he's selling a joke. "Shall we open at $1? A fisherman near the front waved his hand. $1 if you haul it to the dump for me." More laughter. $2, called another man, clearly doing it for sport. Nola was not laughing. She was not looking at the sagging roofline or the gray boards. She was looking at the construction. She had spent enough time in shed rows and net lofts to know the difference between a building thrown up cheap and fast and one built to mean something. The corner joints on this shed were mortised, not spiked. The sill logs, she could see them plainly from here, were 12-inch squared timber, the kind you didn't put under a simple storage shed unless you expected it to stand for a generation. This building had been made with intention. And she noticed something else. The men were looking at what the shed was. She was looking at where it stood. At the end of the Gallant Wharf, that particular spot was where the deep water began, where the big trawlers could berth without touching bottom. It was the most valuable mooring position in the harbor. A shed built into the very end of that wharf structure was not incidental to its location. It was anchored to it. Margot had taught her that the story of a thing was in how it was placed, and why. "Do I hear 3? The auctioneer was raising his gavel. Nola stepped forward. $3. The laughter stopped. Every head turned. She felt the weight of it, the sideways looks, the open disbelief, the particular quality of silence that precedes mockery. The auctioneer blinked. He looked at her. He looked at the crowd. Nobody moved. $3 from the young lady. Going once. He paused. Going twice. He waited, his gavel raised, eyebrows lifted in a question the crowd declined to answer. "Sold." The gavel cracked down. A fresh wave of murmurs spread outward through the men. Someone said, not quietly, that it was a hard lesson but you only learned it once. Someone else hoped she didn't catch cold sleeping in it. Nola walked to the clerk's table. She counted out her 3 silver dollars, every one of them, the last she had, and the clerk handed her the bill of sale, a single sheet of paper that she folded into her coat pocket alongside Margot's bone needle. She turned and walked away from the auction without looking back at any of them. The walk to the end of the wharf took less than 5 minutes, but it was a passage from one kind of life into another, though she didn't know it yet. The planking underfoot was old but sound. The wind off the strait pushed at her from the east, carrying brine and the distant smell of wood smoke. At the end of the wharf, where the water went deep and green-black, the shed stood waiting. She stopped a few feet short of it and looked. Up close it was worse than it had appeared from across the auction lot. The door hung on a single hinge. The roof had a visible bow. Swallows had nested in the eaves and left long white streaks down the eastern wall. And yet, the bones were there. 12-inch sills, mortised corners, a substructure that was built not just for a shed, but for something meant to endure. Steep price for a pile of old boards. She turned. A man stood behind her on the wharf, mid-50s, gray at the temples, with a face that had spent 30 years squinting into wind and water. He wore the harbor master's badge on his coat, a small brass thing gone slightly green at the edges. His name was Stuart Cairns, and he was a man who chose his words the way a careful carpenter chose his cuts, one at a time, and not wastefully. He wasn't mocking her. His voice was flat and observational, the way you might note the weather. "I didn't buy the boards," Nola said. He looked at her steadily. "What did you buy?" She held his gaze. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I intend to find out." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the attention a man gives to something unexpected. He gave a short nod, the sort that means fair enough, and walked back up the wharf without another word, leaving Nola alone with her $3 shed at the edge of the deep water. The inside of the shed was dark and smelled of old salt, fish oil, and the particular dusty sweetness of rope left too long in a dry place. Light came through gaps in the walls in thin, pale strips, swallow nests, mouse droppings, a tangle of old buoy lines in one corner, their floats cracked and faded, a workbench along the back wall, its surface dark with decades of tar. And along the right-hand wall, floor to ceiling, lobster trap storage racks, the old-style kind, built from the same heavy timber as the sill logs. Nola stood in the middle of the shed and breathed. It was hers. The first thing in her life that was entirely hers. She began the way Margot had always told her to begin, with the structure. Not what was broken, but what was still whole. She pressed her palm against the walls. She looked at the roof from the inside. The bow was caused by a single failed rafter, one piece, and the rest of the structure was holding fine. Then she turned to the lobster racks. She had spent years in fishing sheds. She knew how trap racks were built. Quick and functional, because fishermen built for use, not for show. But these racks were overbuilt. The back boards were tongue and groove. There was a framing element along the bottom of the lowest rack that made no sense for simple storage. It was too thick, too finished, too deliberate. She knelt and looked closer. Along the bottom rail of the lowest rack, there was a seam in the wood, almost invisible. But the grain on the inside edge of the seam ran differently from the grain on the face. It was a separate piece, fitted in, not grown there, and the seam itself was too straight, too clean, to be a natural crack. She reached into her pocket and took out Margot's bone needle. Margot had said more than once that a good needle could feel a flaw in a net from the inside, before your eyes could find it from the outside. Nola pressed the tip into the seam. She ran it along, feeling the way she had felt 10,000 times for the hidden weakness in a mesh. A faint click. The bottom board of the rack swung open on hidden wooden hinges. Inside the dark recess, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, was a flat tin box, heavy in her hands. Nola did not shake. She was not the kind of person who shook easily. Margot had not raised her that way. But she sat back on her heels in that cold shed and looked at the thing in her hands for a long moment. And the only sound was the water moving beneath the wharf pilings. She carried the box to the doorway, into the flat gray morning light, and sat down on the threshold. She used the edge of the bone needle to break the wax seal and pried the lid open. Inside, folded in oilcloth, was a sheaf of papers. Beneath the papers, a small leather drawstring pouch. She loosened it and looked inside. Gold coins, their faces still clear and sharp. She set the pouch aside and unfolded the documents with careful hands. The first was a crown grant, dated 1869, recording the assignment of commercial fishing rights over the whole of Gallant Harbour. All deep-water berths, all shellfish grounds, all commercial mooring access, to one Elspeth Gall, in recognition of her role as sole financier of the Gallant Wharf extension. The grant was registered with the Provincial Land Office, and the grant was tied, by its own language, to the physical terminus structure of the wharf, to this shed. There were more papers, survey records, lien documents, a letter from a solicitor confirming that Elspeth Gall had legally bundled the fishing rights with the physical shed as a single indivisible asset. The reasoning was clear in every line. The company she had financed alongside several Pictou merchants was collapsing. She had put in her own money for the wharf extension. She intended that money to mean something, even if the men around her spent theirs into the ground. And at the bottom of the stack, a letter, handwritten, small, precise script. The ink faded to brown at the edges, but every word still legible. To whoever finds this, October 3rd, 1871. My name is Elspeth Gall. I built the end of this wharf with my own savings, against the better judgment of men who knew the value of money only when it was theirs. I financed the survey. I paid for the extension timbers. I registered the fishing rights in my own name, because I had learned by then that a woman's name on a document is the only thing the law cannot quietly remove from her without argument. The company I entered into will fail. The men I trusted will squander what is not theirs to squander. But this shed, this building I had constructed at the end of the wharf, the one that anchors the whole grant, this they cannot touch without touching me. I have confirmed it with a solicitor. The rights and the structure are one. Whoever holds the clear title to this shed holds the lease on this harbor. I have no children. I am placing these documents here as an act of faith, the same faith I placed in the harbor itself, and in the belief that someone will eventually come along who has the eyes to see what others have walked past. In the pouch you will find $60 in gold coin. It is not a fortune, but it is enough to begin. I hope this harbor finds good hands. I hope whoever you are not afraid of hard work. The lease is sound. The title is clear. The rest is yours to build. Elspeth Gall. Nola read the letter twice. The wind came off the strait and moved her hair. A gull cried somewhere overhead. And then, for the first time since Margot had died in her chair on that cold February morning, Nola Birch put her face in her hands and wept. Not from grief and not from self-pity. From the particular, aching relief of a person who has been walking in the dark for a very long time and has just finally felt solid ground beneath her feet. The next morning, she went to find Stuart Cairns. He was in the harbour master's office at the foot of the wharf, sitting over a cup of tea and a chart of the strait. He looked up when she came in, said nothing, and waited, which was his way of saying he was listening. She set the tin box on his chart table and laid the documents out. One by one, she did not explain, she let him read. He was quiet for a long time. He picked up the Crown Grant and held it toward the window light. He read the lean documents with his jaw set and his breathing steady. When he finally set the papers down, he rubbed his hand across his face slowly, the way a man does when he is rearranging something large inside his mind. "Good God," he said quietly. He looked at her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face. Uncomplicated respect. "You didn't buy a fish shed?" "No," Nola said. "You bought the harbour rights." "I believe so. I need someone who understands provincial land law to confirm I'm reading it correctly." He nodded once, deliberate. "Percy Galt. His office is on the upper road, above the hardware store. He's not a showy man, but he's honest and he knows this county's records better than anyone within 100 miles. Percy Galt was a quiet man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, who listened to Nola's account without expression and examined the documents for nearly 2 hours, occasionally making small notations on a yellow legal pad. When he finally looked up, his face was entirely calm, which was somehow more striking than excitement would have been. "The chain of title is unbroken," he said. "The Crown Grant is registered and was never discharged. The lien instrument is valid. When the county auctioned the shed as a standalone asset, they did so without awareness of the attached rights, a significant oversight on their part, but the legal effect is the same. The rights transferred with the structure." He paused. Miss Gall was a very careful woman. Together, they walked to the county registrar's office in the old stone building at the top of the hill. The registrar, a heavy-set man who had been at the auction and found the whole affair quite amusing, was not amused now. He called his deputy. They conferred in low, urgent voices over the documents for 40 minutes. They checked their own records 3 times. At the end of it, they stamped the papers. Nola Birch walked out of that building in the late afternoon, light with her name on the commercial fishing rights of Gallant Harbour. The sun was low and gold over the strait. She could see the shed from where she stood, small and gray at the end of the long wharf. She stood there alone. For a moment, the folded documents warm in her coat pocket, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. The men who had laughed at her 4 days ago were already quiet. Word travels fast in a harbour town. The work, of course, was only beginning. Ownership on paper is a door. You still have to build the house behind it. Nola used $10 of Elspeth's gold to buy supplies: paint, roofing tar, a new door hinge, oakum for the sills, seams, provisions for a week. She spent the first 2 weeks repairing the shed herself. She replaced the failed rafter with new lumber from the mill. She rehung the door so it closed square and true. She scraped the swallow mess off the eastern wall and painted the boards with black tar to seal them against the salt air. She washed the windows, both of them small, both of them stubborn with years of grime, until the morning light came through clean and clear. Stuart Cairns appeared on the 4th day, without announcement, carrying a toolbox. He said nothing by way of explanation. He looked at the roof repair she had already completed, gave a single grunt that might have been approval, and began rebuilding the worst of the trap racks with new lumber. He came back 3 evenings that week. He showed her how to re-caulk the lower sills with oakum, how to check the wharf pilings for soft spots, how to read the tide tables posted in his office, and understand what they meant for the deep-water berths. He was a patient teacher, in the way of people who don't think of themselves as teachers. He simply showed, assumed you were watching, and moved on. He spoke very little about his own life. But one evening, working on a window frame in the last of the light, he said, without looking up, "My wife built things, built them right. From the start, I don't have much patience for people who don't put in the work. You put in the work." That was all. But Nola understood it for what it was. Owen McCree, a fish merchant with a large trawler and a longer memory than most, came down to the wharf 2 weeks after the registration. He was a direct man who did not waste time. "You hold the deep-water berths," he said. "I do," Nola said. "I've been mooring in them for 11 years under an arrangement with a company that no longer exists." He looked at the shed, then at her. I'd rather have a proper agreement with a proper owner than keep on in a legal gray patch. My boats need those berths. What are your terms? Nola named a fair figure, not punitive, but the kind of rate that acknowledged reality on both sides. Owen McCrae considered it for approximately 10 seconds and put out his hand. On the first of the following month, she opened her ledger, a small bound notebook purchased with the last few cents at the chandlery, and made her first entry. April 1st, 1888. First month's mooring fee, O. McCrae, 2 trawlers, payment received. It was not a large sum, but it was real. It was the first money she had earned that wasn't borrowed from a store of coins that could only go one direction. Other arrangements followed. The fishing captains who had been paying mooring fees into a void came to her, one by one, in the practical way of working men who prefer certainty over confusion. Stewart helped her understand the records. Percy Galt drafted simple, clean contracts. By late summer, the shed had a new roof. By autumn, Nola had fitted a net-mending station along the south wall, a long wooden frame where she could hang and work a full sails. And 2 women from the town, both skilled in the craft, came asking for steady work. She paid them a fair wage. Word of that spread in the particular quiet way that fairness spreads. And it did more for her name than any advertisement could have. The fishing community stopped calling her the young woman who'd bought the broken shed. They called her Miss Birch, the one who held the harbor rights, and their voices had a weight in them that she did not mistake for fame. It was something more durable, recognition. She still rented her room above the chandlery, but the shed had become her real home in every way that mattered. The place where her work lived, where the life she was building took its shape, where she felt, for the first time since childhood, that she was somewhere she was meant to be. In the evenings, when the boats were in and the harbor had gone quiet, Stewart Cairns would sometimes walk out to the end of the wharf and sit on the old bollard near the door, his hands wrapped around a tin cup, watching the light leave the water. He didn't always speak. Some evenings he stayed 10 minutes, some evenings an hour. His presence was simply steady, and in that steadiness there was a kind of companionship that Nola had not expected and did not take lightly. One evening in late October, the first real cold coming in off the strait, Nola was sitting just inside the shed door with a lantern lit and Elspeth's tin box open on the workbench before her. She had spread the original documents beside her ledger, the Crown grant, the lien papers, the letter, and alongside them she had placed Margot Finnie's bone needle, the one she had carried since February, the one that had found the seam in the bottom rack. 2 objects, Elspeth's faith written in careful brown ink, Margot's hands pressed into polished bone. She looked at them for a long time and listened to the water move against the pilings below. Margot would have understood this shed. She would have walked its boards, noted the joinery, given a short approving sound, and told Nola to get back to work. She would not have said she was proud. She would not have needed to. The needle in Nola's hand was all the inheritance Margot had left her, and it had been, as it turned out, exactly enough. The men at the auction had laughed. A thin girl in a patched coat, spending her last $3 on a derelict shed at the end of a wharf, as though she didn't know any better. They had looked at her and seen nothing worth taking seriously. They had not seen what Margot Finnie had spent 12 years teaching her to see. That the story of a thing is in its bones. That value does not announce itself. That the break tells you everything about the stress, if you know how to read it. On the first anniversary of the auction, Stewart Cairns came to the end of the wharf. In the early evening, the harbor going copper and rose in the low light, and he set down 2 cups of tea on the bollard and handed her one without ceremony. "Happy anniversary," he said. She looked at him. "It's not an anniversary." "It is," he said, settling himself with the careful ease of a man who has learned to hold his weight gently. "It's the anniversary of the day you bought a harbor. The day I watched someone look at a broken shed and see what the rest of us had been walking past for 30 years. She looked out at the water, the tea warm in her hands. The shed at her back was solid and square, new-roofed, the windows clean, a light burning steady inside. From somewhere down the wharf came the sound of a net being paid out, hand over hand. One of her women finishing late, unhurried, doing the work right. She thought of Elspeth Gall, who had hidden her faith in the bones of a building and waited nearly 2 decades for someone to find it. She thought of Margot, who had pressed a bone needle into a 9-year-old girl's hands and said, "Learn to read the break before you reach for the needle." The harbor lay before her, wide and still in hers. Nola Birch had been 22 years old, with $3 and a bone needle when she walked to the end of that wharf. It was, as it turned out, everything she needed. Thank you for spending this evening with us. If Nola's story found something in you that you've been carrying quietly, of your own, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. And we'd love to know, is there something that others dismissed, something everyone else walked right past, but that you saw differently? Tell us in the comments below. We'll see you by the fire next time.